The doctors refused to remove a tumor from a poor child. But one surgeon risked his career and did it. When they saw what was inside the boy, everyone in the operating room was shocked. The humble neighborhood streets awakened to the crunch of the first footsteps and the echo of street vendors' cries. Among tightly packed houses and walls worn down by time, life struggled to shine despite the hardships. A ramshackle bus crept along, its wheels raising dust as it hit deep potholes. Inside, Johnny, barely 9, looked out the window, carefully holding a wrinkled drawing of a tree. His eyes gleamed with a spark of innocence, and his smile, though faint, radiated a warmth that seemed to defy the pallor of his face. Beside him, Carol, his mother, sat rigid, her expression tense. Her hands clutched the worn handbag that held the few medical documents she had managed to gather with great effort. The same questions echoed in her mind. What if today we get a solution? What if today they shut the doors on us again? Each jolt of the bus over the potholes seemed to intensify her anguish. The hospital rose before them as a reflection of the system's inequalities. Its facade combined newly painted modern sections with neglected areas, cracked hallways crammed with people. Upon entering, Johnny and Carol were led to the waiting room. The faces around them mirrored their own worries. Fathers and mothers exchanged glances, filled with silent desperation, while children, some hooked up to tubes, others barely conscious, tried to cling to a semblance of normalcy. Johnny took out his notebook and began to draw, but soon his trembling hand lost its strength. He dropped the pencil and, without complaint, rested his head against the back of the chair. Carol watched with her heart in a vice, remembering how her son once ran through the park, full of laughter and energy. Now that vitality seemed a distant memory. At last, a nurse called their name. They walked through a narrow corridor where the echo of their footsteps was the only sound, until they reached Dr. Alvarez's office. He greeted them with a slight nod, his face reflecting the burden of far too many grim tidings. He reviewed Johnny's medical reports with mechanical gestures, barely lifting his gaze. "The tumor has grown significantly," he said in a monotone. "It's affecting vital organs. Surgery at this stage would be extremely risky and, unfortunately, this hospital doesn't have the necessary resources to undertake it." "But he's my son," Carol interjected, her voice breaking. "He's still just a child. He has his whole life ahead of him. There has to be something we can do, doctor, please." Dr. Alvarez avoided her eyes and took a deep breath before continuing. "I understand your desperation, ma'am, but the chances of success are very low. You must prepare yourself for the worst." His words fell like a bucket of cold water. Carol felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet, but she did not allow the tears to fall in front of Johnny. She helped her son dress in silence, her hands trembling as she buttoned up the shirt that looked too big on his frail body. "Mama, it's okay," Johnny said suddenly, placing his hand on hers. His gaze held a tenderness that broke through any barrier. "I'm fine." His smile was forced, but sincere. Carol barely kept her composure. She knew each moment with him was a gift, but also a ticking clock. As they left the office, her son clinging to her arm, a promise formed in her heart. She would not give up, not yet. She had to find a way, even if the whole world seemed determined to slam every door in her face. In a forgotten corner of the hospital, Hector Beltran spent his days surrounded by shadows of the past. The makeshift office he worked in was once an archives room, with grey walls smothered by old papers and crooked certificates collecting dust. It was a cruel irony. Those documents bore witness to a time when his name meant surgical excellence, before that mistake relegated him to a life nearly invisible. Hector was 42, but the weight of the years felt heavier on him. His once well-groomed hair was now disheveled, and the circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and regret. In his hands lay a file he was reviewing without true interest. Just another minor case, a consultation that hardly tested his knowledge. No longer was he the surgeon tackling complex operations or receiving applause at conferences. Now he dealt with infected wounds, appendicitis cases, and small procedures that required none of the precision or talent that once placed him at the top. Each appointment was a mechanical routine that sank him deeper into monotony. "Next," he muttered, not even looking up when a patient entered his office. For him, the days passed as an endless repetition, a cycle with no escape. His life had become a self-imposed penance, marked by the hasty decision in surgery that cost a patient's life, and along with it, his own reputation, his family, and his confidence. During his coffee break, Hector walked to the vending machine in the hallway. The hospital's sounds surrounded him: hurried footsteps, distant beeping monitors, and muffled conversations that rarely caught his attention. Yet this time, a different voice stopped him. It was firm, charged with frustration and determination. "I need to speak to someone who truly cares about saving lives," Carol demanded. Hector paused mid-sip, curiosity stirred. From the corridor's corner, he watched the scene unfold. Carol faced Dr. Alvarez, shoulders squared, eyes filled with a blend of anger and despair. Even from a distance, Hector could feel the energy she radiated. A few meters away, Johnny sat on a bench against the wall. His thinness was obvious, and though he tried to remain upright, his body seemed to surrender to exhaustion. Hector noticed how the boy clutched a drawing as if it were a talisman against adversity. Hector tried to ignore it, telling himself it wasn't his concern. But something about that scene drew him in. Carol's determination echoed a past he had locked away, memories of times he battled the impossible. And Johnny. The child reminded him of someone who still haunted his dreams, his own son. His chest tightened with pain, transporting him back to the day he lost his boy, not due to a medical mistake, but to an accident that befell him after he had already lost everything else. For a few moments, Hector stood still, waging an internal debate. Logic told him not to get involved, to keep following his routine and maintain his distance. But there was something there, something in Carol's defiance of the system and in Johnny's vulnerability that sparked a long dormant flame inside him. As he returned to his office, Carol's words echoed in his mind. Someone who cares about saving lives. Hector couldn't shake the feeling that those words were aimed at him as well, a call to something he had long abandoned. For the first time in years, he sensed that maybe not everything was lost. The pediatric ward was a place of contrasts. Amid bright wall colors and toys scattered on the floor, a heavy air of uncertainty and fragility prevailed. Johnny, seated in a corner by a low table, drew shaky lines in his notebook. His picture of the magical tree, though unfinished, offered a glimpse into a world he missed, an escape to days that were happy, a refuge from the disease consuming him. Suddenly, Lily appeared before him with the energy of a whirlwind. She was 10, thin, with pale skin, but her smile lit up the room as if adversity held no power over her. Though hooked to an IV stand and limited in her movements, her voice was vibrant, and her presence radiated contagious warmth. Her hair, now a faint memory of what it once was, did nothing to dampen the confidence she projected. "Is that a magical tree?" Lily asked, leaning slightly to see Johnny's drawing. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. Surprised by the interruption, Johnny barely raised his gaze. "It's a tree my mom and I used to visit," he answered softly. "It was special. It always made us feel better." "Then it's definitely magical," Lily exclaimed with a delight that disarmed Johnny's shyness. "It must have secret powers. I bet it can cure both of us." For the first time in days, Johnny smiled, caught up in Lily's enthusiasm. A spark of conversation ignited between them. As Johnny spoke of memories beneath that tree, Lily began weaving imaginary stories around it. To her, the tree was an ancient guardian, its roots hiding treasures, its highest branches home to a mystical bird that granted wishes. Hours slipped by without their notice. Between laughter and worn-out crayons, the two children created a shared world full of adventure. Lily, with her inexhaustible imagination, told tales of heroes vanquishing monsters, inspired by stories her grandmother once told her before illness took her far from home. Encouraged by his new friend, Johnny added details to these adventures, sketching heroes with capes and magic swords, and monsters with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. The connection between them was immediate, as if the universe had assigned them a special place in each other's lives. For Johnny, Lily was a spark of joy in the darkness surrounding him. Her energy and courage reminded him that there were still reasons to smile. For Lily, Johnny was a companion who understood her struggle without explanations, someone with whom she could dream and forget, if only for a while, the tubes and the needles. When a nurse came to adjust Lily's IV drip, she took one of the drawings and handed it to Johnny. "This is so you won't forget that we're going to visit that magic tree together someday. I promise." Johnny accepted it carefully, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I promise," he replied. In that moment, the pediatric ward, with all its heaviness and fragility, turned into a space of hope for them, a small corner where dreams were still possible. Carol stood in the hospital's main hallway, gripping Johnny's file tightly. Her gaze reflected a mix of anguish and determination as she waited before the imposing door to the office of Dr. Alberto Montiel, the hospital's administrator. The corridor's walls were decorated with photographs of smiling doctors and hung-up awards, but to Carol, these images were nothing more than a hollow facade. Her only mission was to get the help her son so desperately needed. At last, a secretary opened the door and motioned her inside. Carol took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves consuming her, and entered. Montiel's office was spacious and orderly, with modern furniture and a cold atmosphere that seemed to mirror his personality. Montiel, a man around 50, impeccably dressed and with a distant look, greeted her with a professional smile that never reached his eyes. "Mrs. Carroll, I understand you're here about your son, Johnny," said Montiel as he flipped through the file, his calm demeanor at odds with the urgency on Carol's face. "Dr. Montiel, I need you to approve his surgery. I know it won't be easy, but he's a child. We can't give up before trying," she pleaded, her voice laden with emotion. Montiel closed the file with a calculated gesture. "Ma'am, believe me, I understand your concern, but this hospital has limited resources. The success rate of this surgery is extremely low, and taking such a risk is not feasible. There are other patients who might benefit more from those resources." Carol felt the words burn in her chest. "Other patients? Are you saying my son doesn't deserve the same chance as everyone else? He's just a child." Montiel remained unruffled. "I'm sorry to be so blunt, but we must prioritize cases with better odds. The surgery your son needs is too big a gamble." Heavy silence followed. Carol stood up, tears gathering in her eyes. "How many children like Johnny must die before you do something?" she shouted, releasing the mix of frustration and despair she had held back for so long. Unmoved, Montiel simply straightened the papers on his desk. "I understand your pain, ma'am, but these are the system's limitations. We do the best we can with what we have." Carol left the office, feeling as if the weight of the world had grown heavier on her shoulders. Her steps were slow, almost dragging, as she walked down the hall. She passed by Hector Beltran, who was looking over a schedule board near Montiel's office. Though Carol didn't notice him, Hector caught enough fragments of her conversation to understand something serious was happening. The image of Carol, devastated yet still standing, stuck in Hector's mind. He couldn't help recalling families he had once confronted with bad news, and above all, he remembered his own mistake, the one that had ended his career and stolen his family away. Carol's voice rang in his mind. He's just a child. That night, sitting in his cramped office, Hector took out Johnny's file, which he had secretly borrowed from the archives. He read every detail, from the diagnosis to the medical recommendations. The severity of the case took his breath away, but what affected him most was Johnny's vulnerability. The boy he had seen on that bench, exhausted yet clutching his drawing, seemed burdened with a weight far too large for his age. Hector closed the file and rested his forehead on his hands. For the first time in years, a spark of his old passion as a doctor began to glow within him. He knew that helping Johnny would mean defying the system, risking himself again, and facing his own fears. But something told him this case could not be ignored. He was a child, and Hector knew he had already allowed too many doors to close in the past. Night fell over the hospital, leaving the corridors in unsettling silence. Hector Beltran sat in his tiny office, surrounded by papers and medical studies he had amassed in recent hours. His mind worked with surgical precision, examining every possible option for treating Johnny's case. The pages were filled with scribbles and diagrams, frantic notes attempting to build a plan to tackle what seemed impossible. By his desk, a small broken photo frame drew his attention. Inside it, an image of his son smiled, pure and radiant. Hector had kept that photo hidden, as if seeing it too often could reopen wounds that never fully healed. His finger traced the worn frame while memories flooded his mind. Guilt, loss, and fear, shadows that had followed him for years, blended now with a new emotion: determination. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. In that moment, he made a decision he knew would change his life. He would operate on Johnny, no matter the consequences. For the first time in years, he felt he had something to gain, something worth fighting for. By dawn, Hector left his office in search of Rose, a veteran nurse who had worked with him in his better days. He found her in the supply room, sorting boxes of medications with the skill of someone who knew every corner of the hospital. "Rose," Hector said in a grave tone that made her pause, "I need your help." Rose looked at him curiously, and soon her expression turned worried as Hector explained his plan. He told her about Johnny's case, about his decision to perform the surgery without the hospital's approval. Rose listened silently, weighing his words. Finally, she sighed. "You know this could cost you your career, Hector. Maybe even more," she said, voice heavy. "I know," he replied, "but I can't just stand by and do nothing. This boy deserves a chance. If I fail, at least I tried." Rose studied his face as if looking for something there. After a few seconds, she nodded slowly. "You've always been a good doctor, Hector. You just need to remember who you were before all this," she said with a slight smile. "Count me in." With Rose's support secured, Hector headed to the lab to find Michael, a technician known for his obsessive dedication to his work. Michael was young, brilliant, always eager for scientific challenges. But when Hector explained his plan, Michael's initial reaction was doubt. "You want to perform a surgery of this magnitude without the hospital's approval? And with what resources? This is madness," Michael said, arms crossed. "I know, Michael," Hector answered firmly. "But this isn't just about medicine, it's personal. If we let the system decide who lives and who dies, what's left of us as doctors? I need your help. This child needs our help." Michael remained silent for a long moment, staring at the reports Hector showed him. Finally, he exhaled and extended his hand. "All right, let's do it. But if this is going to work, we need flawless precision and planning." As the team began to form, Hector felt a spark of hope. That afternoon, as he watched from a hospital window, he saw Carol pushing Johnny's wheelchair through the small garden. The child, though fragile, raised his eyes to the sky and smiled. Hector couldn't help imagining a future where Johnny ran free, far from machines and devastating diagnoses. At that instant, he knew with absolute clarity he would do whatever it took to save that boy, even if it meant risking his career, his reputation, and the little he had left. Because sometimes, a single act of courage could restore one person's life and another's redemption. The afternoon sun illuminated the hospital's small garden, a corner seemingly untouched by the bustle and despair reigning inside. Young shrubs and trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches hardly dense enough to cast a shadow. There, amid that space, Johnny and Lily sat on a bench, worn crayons and open sketchbooks balanced on their laps. Lily, with her trademark energy and determination, made quick, bold strokes in her notebook. Her eyes shone with excitement as her drawing took shape, a giant tree with branches reaching up to the sky. Johnny, more reserved, watched silently as his friend brought something so magical to life on the page. "See this tree?" Lily said, showing him her drawing. "It's an imaginary forest. We'll build our treehouse here. It'll be incredible. Just wait and see." With expansive gestures and a radiant smile, Lily painted her vision. "It'll have a rope to climb up, a secret ladder, and a special hiding spot for treasures. From the top, we can see the stars every night, and no one will ever find us. It'll be our magical refuge." Johnny listened intently, and for the first time in a long while, something inside him began to kindle. He picked up his own notebook and, with slow but determined strokes, started to sketch his version of the tree. He drew thick branches to hold a hammock, a swing dangling from a rope, and a small window through which they could look out at the world. When Lily finished her drawing, she handed it to Johnny with a solemn air. "This is for you," she said. "It's our promise that someday we'll build this treehouse, but you have to promise that you'll be there to make it happen." Johnny held the drawing in trembling hands, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in ages. He looked up and smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I promise I'll be there," he said softly. That small exchange was more than just words. For Johnny, it represented a beacon of hope amid the darkness of his illness. For the first time, his mind was occupied with something other than his condition. It was a dream, a future he could picture beyond the hospital's walls. From a nearby window, Carol watched the children, her heart filled with conflicting emotions. The laughter and complicity between Johnny and Lily brought her a brief respite from her own emotional exhaustion. Seeing her son, so fragile and weary these last months, now smiling and talking about a future, however imaginary, sparked a tiny flame of hope within her. At that moment, Carol knew that no matter what happened, she would do everything possible to keep that spark alive in her son, because even though his time might seem limited, the dreams Johnny shared with Lily were proof that there were still reasons to fight. In the heart of the hospital, where the silence of the laboratory was broken only by the hum of equipment, Michael worked with unwavering focus. Under the microscope's lens, a sample of tissue taken from Johnny's biopsy revealed unexpected details. His hands moved with surgical precision as he adjusted the focus and jotted down quick notes in a notebook filled with haphazard scribbles. Suddenly, something caught his eye. Within the malignant tissue, tiny particles gleamed with a metallic reflection under the light. Michael frowned, intrigued. "What is this?" he murmured to himself, preparing the sample for more detailed analysis. The presence of those particles was unusual, and his instincts told him he needed to dig deeper. Over the next few hours, Michael conducted exhaustive tests. He analyzed the chemical composition with spectrometry and other advanced methods. Finally, the results were clear. The particles were composed of cadmium, a highly toxic heavy metal known for causing severe harm to the body, including cancer. The discovery left Michael unsettled. How could this material have ended up in a child like Johnny? He reviewed the patient's background again, going over environmental and health data from the neighborhood where the boy lived. Connecting the dots, he began to notice a troubling pattern. Other patients from the same area suffered from similarly severe conditions, many linked to exposure to contaminants. Determined to learn more, Michael broadened his research. He dug into old archives, environmental records, and public health reports. There he found it. References to a company called Industrias Cobalto, known in the past for dumping chemical waste near Johnny's neighborhood. The documents revealed a history of contamination complaints that never reached trial, seemingly buried by the company's influence and power. Michael sat at his desk, surrounded by sheets of diagrams, graphs, and reports. The magnitude of the problem was crushing. It wasn't just Johnny's case. This was a systemic issue that had afflicted an entire community for decades. His frustration grew as he realized that, while the company operated with impunity, the most vulnerable paid the price with their health and their lives. With his findings in hand, Michael decided he could not remain silent. This was not just a medical issue, it was a social and ethical problem demanding immediate action. That same night, he headed to Hector Beltran's small office. He found the surgeon reviewing notes at his desk, his face reflecting the weight of his recent decisions. "Hector, you have to see this," Michael said, dropping a folder full of documents in front of him. "This goes beyond medicine. Johnny's case is just the tip of the iceberg." Hector examined the papers quietly while Michael explained his discoveries. Hector's expression shifted from disbelief to outrage as he grasped the gravity of the situation. "We're not just dealing with a disease," said Michael firmly. "We're facing a system that allowed this to happen. Industrias Cobalto poisoned that community, and Johnny is just one of its victims." Hector nodded slowly, processing the information. His thoughts returned to the boy he had seen in the garden, drawing with Lily, clinging to dreams despite his reality. This was not just a fight to save Johnny, it was a struggle against something much bigger. "This changes everything," Hector murmured, his gaze hardening, voice filled with new resolve. "We can't let this continue." Together, they knew they stood at the start of a war against an invisible but powerful enemy. The hospital cafeteria was a no-frills place. Vending machines hummed constantly, accompanied by the metallic clink of coins and the click of pressed buttons. Doctors and nurses occupied the tables, whispering quietly or eating in silence, letting their fatigue weigh heavier than words. Hector and Carol sat in a corner, away from the bustle, 2 cups of coffee in front of them. Hector seemed uneasy, his fingers drumming softly on the table as he stared into the dark liquid in his cup. Carol, though tired, watched him curiously. There was something about his demeanor, an inner sadness and conflict, that made him seem more human than she had initially imagined. "There's something you need to know," Hector began, his voice barely audible. He took a sip of coffee, as if seeking courage in the bitter taste, then continued. "I haven't always been the man you see now." Carol leaned forward slightly, sensing that he was about to share something important. Hector averted his eyes, fixing them on an indeterminate spot on the floor. "Years ago, I was a respected surgeon. I worked at one of the best hospitals in the country, took on complex cases, challenged the impossible, and succeeded. Until one day, I didn't." Hector paused, his breathing uneven, as though each word cost him a tremendous effort. Carol remained silent, not wanting to interrupt. "It was a complicated surgery, a young patient with slim chances. I decided to take a risk, but I made a hasty decision. It was a mistake. The patient didn't survive." Hector pressed his lips together, his hands trembling slightly. "His family was devastated. I was devastated, and the hospital quickly made it clear there was no room for failure." Carol felt a knot in her stomach, but said nothing, allowing Hector to go on. "That was just the beginning. My wife never understood what it meant to lose a patient. She thought I was strong, but I wasn't. I couldn't deal with her disappointment, with my own guilt. She left, taking our son." Hector paused again, his eyes now gleaming with tears he refused to shed. "A few months later, my son died in an accident. I wasn't there for him. I had lost everyone." Carol raised a hand to her mouth, shocked by the depth of the pain Hector carried. She had never imagined that behind the reserved, distant man was such a harrowing story. "Ever since, well, here I am, exiled in this hospital, handling minor cases, surviving but not really living." Hector let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "I guess this is what I deserve." A heavy silence settled between them. Carol, still processing what she had heard, felt something inside her shift. For the first time, she saw Hector not just as the doctor trying to save her son, but as a man burdened by deep pain. pain that had defined him, but not completely destroyed him. "You know, Hector," she finally said, her voice soft but firm, "I don't think you deserve this. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do afterward." Hector looked up, surprised by the warmth in Carol's words. Their eyes met, and though they said nothing more, the connection between them was palpable. Their gazes held a tacit promise, a mutual understanding. Both had faced unimaginable losses, and though their paths differed, they shared the same purpose, fighting for what mattered. Carol offered him a gentle smile, a gesture that needed no words to convey its message. For the first time in a long while, Hector allowed himself to return the smile, small but genuine. Between them, an invisible bond formed, an alliance that promised to be stronger than any obstacle they might face. Montiel's office was utterly silent, save for the rustle of papers as he reviewed documents. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, as he sorted financial reports and reviewed administrative decisions. Suddenly, his secretary entered with a grave expression, holding a folder marked "Urgent." Montiel looked up and frowned as she handed him a copy of a leaked report. "What's this?" he asked, his voice laced with distrust. The secretary responded in a hushed tone. "It's a report on Dr. Beltran's plans to operate on patient Johnny without the hospital's official authorization." Montiel adjusted his glasses and began to read. His expression shifted from surprise to barely contained anger as he scanned the pages. When he finished, he dropped the folder onto his desk with a sharp thud and ordered, "Call Dr. Beltran, now." Hector arrived at the office minutes later, feeling the weight of the secretary's gaze as she led him inside. Upon entering, Montiel stood behind his desk, arms crossed, wearing an expression that mingled authority and disdain. "Dr. Beltran, can you explain what this means?" Montiel said, pointing to the folder on his desk. His tone wasn't a question, but an accusation. Hector kept his composure. "It means I'm trying to save a life that you and this system seem willing to abandon." Montiel let out an irritated sigh and leaned forward, hands on the desk. "Listen carefully, Hector. If you proceed with this surgery, it will be considered a grave violation of our policies. Not only will you lose your job, but I will personally ensure you're reported to the medical board. You will never practice medicine again. Understand?" For a moment, Montiel's words filled the air like a tangible threat, heavy and inescapable. Though shaken, Hector showed no weakness. He held his ground, gaze locked on Montiel's. "I understand perfectly," Hector said firmly. "But I also understand that my duty as a doctor is to my patients, not to this hospital's bureaucracy. If I have to risk my career to save that child, I will. Because someone has to." Montiel clenched his jaw, clearly frustrated by Hector's lack of submission. "It's not as simple as you think, Beltran. There are rules, priorities, limited resources." "And lives at stake," Hector interrupted, raising his voice for the first time. "This hospital can have all the rules it wants, but I won't look away while a child dies because you don't want to risk your budget." The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Montiel straightened up and, with a cold gesture, pointed to the door. "Consider yourself warned. If you go through with this, you'll face the consequences." Hector left the office with a racing heart, but even greater determination. Montiel's words hadn't intimidated him. In fact, they had only strengthened his resolve. Johnny deserved better, and Hector would not stop now. Meanwhile, in the pediatric ward, Lily and Johnny sat in their usual corner. Lily held up a new drawing she'd made, a detailed design of their longed-for treehouse. On the paper, the tree looked enormous, its branches stretching as if to embrace the sky. There was a room for each of them, decorated windows, and flags fluttering in the breeze. "See this?" Lily said, pointing to the rope ladder she'd drawn. "We'll climb up here, and this will be your room. From here we can see the stars every night." Johnny, smiling, took a pencil and added a detail, a swing hanging from one of the highest branches. "And we'll put this here so we can swing higher than the clouds," he said, eyes bright. Lily clapped excitedly. "I love it! I can already imagine it! It'll be the best place in the world!" The two children spent hours dreaming of their imaginary haven, far from needles and monitors, far from the hospital's grey walls. Their friendship had become a fortress, a safe space where they could simply be children, where dreams were bigger than their difficulties. From the hallway, Rose watched them with a melancholy smile. She knew Johnny's days were uncertain, but in that moment, seeing the laughter he shared with Lily, she felt hope, a spark that Hector was determined to turn into a flame of life. In the hospital's laboratory, lit by cold, steady fluorescent lights, Michael pored over the pages of an old newspaper article, his tired but focused eyes scanning lines highlighted in red ink. Around him, a state of organized chaos, papers, charts, and lab samples reflected the intensity of his investigation. With every document he read, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Fines against Industrias Cobalto for chemical spills had been reported multiple times over the past decades. Yet none of the cases ever went to trial, buried under what now seemed obvious, the company's political influence. Michael found letters from government officials defending the corporation and testimonies from local residents who had been silenced by threats or paltry compensations. His findings left him chilled. The contamination wasn't an isolated incident. It was a systemic problem that had harmed an entire community. Johnny wasn't the only victim, just one among many. Michael realized he couldn't keep this information to himself. He gathered the key documents and went to see Rose, who was reorganizing supplies in the pediatric area. "Rose, you have to see this," he said, placing the papers on a table. Patiently, he explained his discoveries, from the cadmium particles in Johnny's sample to reports linking Industrias Cobalto to severe illnesses in the neighborhood. Rose reviewed the documents carefully, her expression hardening as she progressed. "This is unacceptable," she said at last. "This isn't just negligence, it's criminal. How many families have lost their children to this company while everyone looked the other way?" Michael nodded. "Exactly. We can't let this continue, but we need help to expose it. This is bigger than us." Rose fell silent for a few seconds, then said, "I know someone who might help. Claudio Rojas, a journalist. He's worked on similar cases, uncovering corruption and environmental negligence. If anyone can give this visibility, it's him." Resolute, Michael and Rose acted immediately. They contacted Claudio, who received them in his cramped office the next day. A middle-aged man with a penetrating gaze, he was surrounded by piles of papers and newspaper clippings. As Rose and Michael explained the case, Claudio never took his eyes off them, scribbling rapid, detailed notes. "This could be huge," Claudio finally said. "But I need more proof, more connections. If this is as big as it seems, it could shake not only the company, but also the institutions that protected it." Claudio promised to investigate further, vowing not to stop until he exposed the truth. Meanwhile, Hector remained focused on the clandestine operation. He meticulously reviewed every step of the procedure, ensuring the team was ready and that no detail was overlooked. Though unaware of Michael and Rose's findings, he sensed the tension in the air growing thicker by the day. That afternoon, Rose decided to speak with Hector. She found him in his office, reviewing medical studies. "Hector, there's something you need to know," she began cautiously. Hector looked up, surprised by Rose's serious tone. She explained what Michael had discovered, the links between Industrias Cobalto and Johnny's illness, and similar cases. "This isn't just a tumor," Rose said, folding her arms tightly. "It's the result of years of negligence and corruption. And if we manage to operate on Johnny, we'll be striking at something much bigger too." Hector remained silent, processing the information. He already knew his decision was risky, but now he understood that he wasn't just fighting for a life. He was fighting against a truth many wanted hidden. Finally, he looked at Rose with determination. "Then we must ensure Johnny survives. If this is bigger than we thought, we need to win this first battle." The tension in the hospital was palpable. The gears of a greater struggle were beginning to turn, and each member of the team understood that what was at stake went beyond any operating room. The hospital awoke to its usual bustle. Nurses adjusting monitors, doctors reviewing charts, and families waiting wearily for news. Amid the organized chaos, Sophia walked the corridors in her pristine white coat, her face seemingly serene, though her mind whirled with doubts. Sophia was in the final years of her medical residency, a period when decisions were crucial and pressures overwhelming. Since Rose had hinted that Hector planned to operate on Johnny without the hospital's approval, Sophia had not known a moment's peace. Although her movements were efficient and her professionalism unquestioned, every step she took was weighed down by uncertainty. Hector had always been an intriguing figure to her. He was a surgeon with a reputation stained by failure, yet his skill and knowledge were undeniable. In the few times they had worked together, Sophia had witnessed his dexterity and deep understanding of medicine. But she also knew that getting involved with someone like Hector in an unauthorized operation meant risking everything she had worked so hard to achieve. As she walked through the pediatric ward, Sophia saw Johnny and Lily playing in a corner. The children's laughter filled the air, a note of joy in an environment dominated by suffering. Lily was showing one of her drawings to Johnny, enthusiastically explaining the details of their imaginary treehouse. Although the children tried to remain optimistic, the IV tubes hanging beside them and the shadows on their mothers' faces were constant reminders of reality. Sophia watched Carol, standing next to Johnny, her expression a mixture of hope and exhaustion. The love and determination of that woman were palpable, and Sophia couldn't help wondering what it would be like to face something as immense as losing a child. Her gaze shifted to other parents in the room, whose faces reflected the same blend of fear and resignation. For a moment, Sophia closed her eyes. She thought about Montiel, about the bureaucracy he enforced, about the rules that seemed designed more to protect the hospital than its patients. But she also thought about the consequences of defying that system. If something went wrong in the surgery, not only would Hector bear the repercussions, she would be responsible as well. She could lose her place at the hospital, her medical license, and everything she had worked for. That night, in the solitude of her small apartment, Sophia sat at her desk with an open notebook before her. It was where she usually wrote about the cases that had affected her, a way to process the emotions she couldn't show at the hospital. On a blank page, she wrote Johnny's name. Her hand trembled slightly as the pen laid down the black ink. When she finished writing, she stared at the name as though she might find answers in those letters. Slowly, a tear rolled down her cheek and fell onto the paper, smudging the ink. Johnny was not just another patient. He was a child with a life that could still be saved, a child clinging to dreams who deserved a chance, even though the system seemed determined to deny it to him. Sophia closed her eyes and breathed deeply. She knew she couldn't run from the decision looming over her. Sooner or later, she would have to choose between following the rules or following her heart. And deep down, she was already beginning to understand what her answer would be. The hospital's playroom was a space filled with bright colors and shelves overflowing with children's books, but the atmosphere was marked by the fragility of the kids who spent their days there. Johnny and Lily were seated in a corner, surrounded by cushions that softened their fatigue. Though their bodies were weakened, their spirits shone with a spark that seemed to defy their condition. Lily, with her boundless energy, grabbed a random book from the shelf and opened it with a theatrical gesture. "Today we'll read about the heroes who saved the world," she exclaimed. But instead of reading the printed words, she began to invent her own story. Once upon a time, there was a magical tree that could talk. Its branches were so long they touched the clouds, and in its roots lived tiny guardians who protected its secrets. One day, 2 brave warriors arrived seeking its help. Lily paused dramatically and looked at Johnny with a smile. And who do you think those warriors were? Johnny, who had been listening with wide eyes, finally smiled. "Us?" "Exactly," Lily exclaimed, delighted. "Us. And together, We built a house in its highest branches to keep safe from the world. The story continued, growing with each detail they added. After a while, Lily pulled a drawing carefully preserved in her backpack. It was a detailed plan of their longed-for treehouse. "Look, this is what I've imagined," she said, handing it to Johnny. The drawing showed a sturdy house with a climbing rope, a flag made of scraps of cloth, a secret trapdoor for hiding treasures, and windows decorated with flowers. Johnny took it gently, studying each line. Inspired, he began drawing his own version in a notebook he always carried. He added a hanging swing and a spiral staircase that reached up to the stars. "And here," Johnny said, pointing to a branch in his drawing, "we could put a hammock to watch the clouds. We'd spend hours up there." Lily clapped her hands excitedly. "It's perfect. Nobody could reach us, and we'd be free to dream as much as we want." The conversation paused for a moment. Lily, looking toward the fluorescent lights on the ceiling, let her smile fade slightly. "You know, Johnny," she said quietly, "sometimes I'm scared. Afraid we'll never leave this hospital. Afraid we'll never build that treehouse." Johnny stopped drawing and looked at her seriously. It was the first time Lily, always so full of energy and positivity, had spoken of her fears. "But meeting you has been the best thing that's ever happened to me," Lily continued in a softer tone. "You make me feel that there are still things worth fighting for, that not everything is lost." Saying nothing, Johnny reached out his small, frail hand toward Lily's. Their fingers intertwined, and though neither spoke, the gesture said it all, a silent promise that they would stand together, no matter what the future held. In that corner of the playroom, far from the worries of adults, two children had found an invincible refuge in their friendship. They were more than companions. They were a beacon of hope for each other, lighting the way through the darkness. The hospital was enveloped in an unusual silence. The hallways, normally filled with constant movement, seemed frozen in time. But for the clandestine team led by Hector, that stillness only made the tension more palpable. Every sound, every shifting shadow felt like a reminder of what was at stake. In a small storage room, Rose meticulously checked the medical supplies. Every clamp, suture, and bandage was perfectly organized, ready to be used in the surgery. Her experience as a veteran nurse was invaluable, but even she couldn't avoid feeling the weight of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Hector sat in his office, facing a notebook covered with scribbled diagrams and notes about the operation. His hands traced the air, rehearsing each surgical move over and over in his mind. His concentration was absolute, yet he couldn't shake the echo of his own fears. The risk was enormous, not just for him, but for the entire team. Michael, in the laboratory, adjusted the monitoring equipment that would be used during the operation. His fingers moved quickly and confidently, connecting cables and calibrating machines. Despite his scientific enthusiasm, he was keenly aware of the gravity of the situation. "Everything must be perfect," he murmured to himself, switching on one of the monitors and watching data lines flicker into life on the screen. Elsewhere in the hospital, Montiel, the administrator, was beginning to suspect that something unusual was going on. The presence of Hector, Rose, and Michael at irregular hours had not gone unnoticed. Determined to prevent any irregularities, Montiel tightened security measures. He assigned an extra night supervisor and began scrutinizing patient records more closely. Each added precaution layered more danger onto the clandestine team's efforts. Meanwhile, on another front, Claudio Rojas pressed on with his investigation. The journalist worked tirelessly, reviewing archived contamination reports and interviewing former employees of Industrias Cobalto. What he discovered was devastating. The company had covered up years of toxic spills in nearby residential areas, bribing officials to avoid sanctions. Claudio found a clear link between those spills and the cancer cases that were ravaging Johnny's community. With every piece of evidence he gathered, Claudio became more convinced that this story had to come to light. He knew he held in his hands not just a case of corporate negligence, but a brutal example of how power and corruption could destroy lives. As the day of the surgery approached, the clandestine team worked with surgical precision. In every preparation, in every instrument adjustment, one could feel their collective determination not to make a single mistake. For Hector, Rose, and Michael, the operation wasn't just an attempt to save Johnny. It was a statement that the system would not have the last word. That night, as the clocks ticked down toward the critical moment, Hector paused by his office window. From there, he could see the hospital's garden, where Johnny and Lily had spent so much time dreaming of their treehouse. He thought of the children, their laughter, their drawings full of hope. That image gave him the strength he needed. "Everything is ready," Rose said when she entered his office. Her voice was steady, but her eyes showed a slight tremor of emotion. Hector nodded, closing his notebook. "Then there's no turning back." They all knew that by crossing this line, they were not only putting their careers on the line, but their very lives as well. Yet at that moment, all that mattered was giving Johnny a chance, no matter the cost. The pediatric ward was calm, bathed in the soft light of late afternoon. Sophia, holding a folder, paused at the door. She had planned on passing through quickly, just to review patient charts, but something compelled her to stay. In one corner, Johnny and Lily sat on the floor, surrounded by crayons and sheets of paper. Johnny drew carefully, his face focused as he sketched a ladder reaching toward the sky. Lily, ever enthusiastic, offered guidance with contagious excitement, pointing out where to place a hammock or a window to get a better view of the stars. Though their bodies were weakened, the vitality of their laughter and the bond they shared filled the room with a uniquely warm energy. Sophia observed from a distance, hesitant to interrupt. Something in the children's interaction struck a chord deep within her, awakening a memory long buried. She closed her eyes for a moment, and an image of her younger brother surfaced with painful clarity. She remembered how he, too, used to draw while fighting an illness that, despite all their efforts, eventually claimed him. Back then, she had been just a child, powerless to do anything but stay by his side. But now was different. Now she had knowledge, skills, and the opportunity to make a difference. However, that knowledge carried a burden, the fear of risking everything and failing. That fear had been her constant companion since Rose mentioned Hector's plan, but as she watched Johnny and Lily, Sophia realized she could no longer afford to hesitate. That night, Hector stood in the storage room, checking the surgical instruments for what felt like the 100th time. Every clamp and suture was perfectly arranged, yet his mind continued to cycle through potential scenarios and complications. Nearby, Rose reviewed the settings on the cardiac monitors with the same intensity. The door opened suddenly, and both looked up. Sophia stood at the threshold, her white coat immaculate, and her expression determined. "What are you doing here?" Hector asked, trying to mask his surprise. "I'm here to help," Sophia answered, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but a hint of vulnerability hid beneath her words. "I know what this means, the risks involved, but I also know I can't stand by and do nothing." Rose exchanged a glance with Hector, and although she tried to hide it, a flash of relief crossed her face. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone a mix of concern and hope. "Completely sure," Sophia replied. "Johnny deserves this chance, and if I can do something to give him a better life, I won't hesitate." Hector nodded slowly. His face remained stoic, but inside he felt a spark of renewed hope. Sophia's decision not only strengthened the team, but reminded him that he was not alone in this fight. "Welcome to the team," he finally said. "We need you." Later that night, in her small apartment, Sophia sat in front of her laptop. Her fingers trembled slightly as she composed the email she had decided to send. It was addressed to Claudio Rojas, the journalist whom Rose and Michael had contacted before. In the email, Sophia detailed how Montiel, the hospital administrator, prioritized bureaucracy and budgets over patients' lives. She included examples of instances where vital resources had been denied to critical patients, and how the hospital's rigid policies were designed more to shield the institution from lawsuits than to save lives. Before sending the email, Sophia paused. She knew that sharing this information not only exposed Montiel, but also put herself at risk. Yet the image of Johnny and Lily laughing together in the pediatric ward filled her mind. She took a deep breath and pressed send. A few minutes later, Claudio replied, "This is exactly what we need," he wrote. "I promise we'll use this information to expose the truth. Every detail helps." Sophia closed her laptop, feeling a mixture of relief and fear. She knew she had just crossed a line with no return, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. As she lay down that night, weighed down by the day's accumulated fatigue, a strange sense of peace enveloped her. She had chosen her path, and now she was ready to face it. At the hospital, Hector, Rose, Michael, and now Sophia worked in silence, preparing for the inevitable. Each carried their own fears and doubts, but together they formed a united front. While they adjusted the final details, the gravity of their mission was undeniable. Johnny's fate, and perhaps that of many others, depended on them. Night fell over the hospital, draping the corridors in a sepulchral silence. At that hour, the lights were dimmed, and only the hum of monitors and distant echoes of the night shift's footsteps broke the stillness. For Hector and his team, the quiet was both a blessing and a reminder of what was at stake. In a secluded part of the hospital, Hector and Rose pushed Johnny's gurney carefully, ensuring every movement was silent. Sophia walked a few steps ahead, watching each corner of the hallway to ensure they had no witnesses. Michael, carrying a portable monitor, brought up the rear, his gaze fixed on the equipment in his hands. Johnny was deeply asleep, prepped for surgery. His small body looked even more fragile under the hospital sheets, yet his breathing remained steady. Carol had placed her trust completely in Hector, handing over her child in the hope of a miracle. They arrived at an operating room they had prepared in secret. It wasn't the most modern or well-equipped, but every instrument, every monitor, every detail had been carefully arranged. Michael moved swiftly, connecting the cardiac monitors as Rose organized the surgical tools with the efficiency that only comes from years of experience. Sophia, though visibly nervous, let none of it affect her performance. She assisted Hector with deliberate motions, anticipating his needs. Hector, his face calm, but his eyes intense with a focus not seen in years, pulled on his surgical gloves. "All set?" he asked in a quiet but firm tone. "Monitors are running," Michael replied. On the screen, Johnny's heartbeat showed up steady and strong. "Instruments ready," Rose confirmed, adjusting the lights to perfectly illuminate the surgical field. Sophia nodded without speaking, holding the scalpel Hector would use to begin. Hector looked at his team, and for a moment, a faint smile of gratitude crossed his face. Then, in a resolute voice, he said, "Let's begin." The operation proceeded with precision, each team member playing their part flawlessly. Hector, demonstrating the skill that had once earned him renown, worked calmly and attentively. Every incision, every movement was calculated. His experience guided him through the labyrinth of Johnny's tumor. Suddenly, the monitor's alarms began to blare. Johnny's heart rate plummeted and his blood pressure dropped drastically. "Hypotension!" Michael exclaimed, quickly adjusting the monitor's settings. Hector kept his composure, but his hands moved faster. "Rose, more fluids. Sophia, prepare an adrenaline dose, now." The team reacted instantly, functioning like a perfectly synchronized machine. Rose increased the IV drip rate, while Sophia filled a syringe with steady hands. Hector administered the dose directly to Johnny's heart with surgical precision. The seconds felt like hours as they all watched the monitor screen. Finally, the lines began to stabilize. Michael sighed with relief. "He's responding," he said, voice filled with contained emotion. Hector nodded, but didn't allow himself a moment's rest. "Let's continue. We can't afford another episode like this." They resumed their work with renewed determination. After hours of concentration and effort, Hector finally removed the tumor, He placed it in a sterile tray and exhaled deeply. The tumor, large and complex though it was no longer a threat to Johnny's life. Rose gave a small smile as she began to clean the room. Michael checked Johnny's vital signs, now stable, and Sophia, though exhausted, felt a surge of satisfaction seeing the tumor removed from their young patient. When everything was settled, Hector removed his surgical gloves and looked at his team. "We did it," he said quietly. No one cheered aloud, but their gazes reflected a shared pride. They had done the impossible. However, reality struck swiftly. Hector knew the operation wouldn't go unnoticed for long. Montiel would discover what they had done, and the consequences would be inevitable. As Rose finished cleaning, Hector approached Johnny, who still slept under the effects of the anesthesia. He gently stroked the boy's forehead, a gesture filled with tenderness and hope. "Rest now, little one. You've got a chance," he whispered. Leaving the operating room, the team walked in silence down the hallway, each aware that the real battle was far from over. They had saved a life, but now they would have to face the consequences of defying the system. Dawn brought an expectant hush to the hospital. In the recovery room, Johnny slowly began to open his eyes. The dim light illuminated his face, and though still weak, there was something different in his expression. A spark Carol had not seen in months was there, shining in his eyes, like a tiny flame that had been extinguished and finally returned. Carol sat beside his bed, taking his hand gently. "Johnny?" she whispered, afraid to break the magic of the moment. Johnny looked at her and smiled faintly. "You know what, Mum? I think we can start building the treehouse today." Carol let out a sob she had been holding in since they'd taken him to surgery. She embraced him carefully, afraid of hurting him, as tears fell freely down her face. They were tears of relief, gratitude, and hope. "My love, you're better. Thank God, you're better." From the doorway, Hector watched in silence. There was something profoundly moving in that scene, a connection that needed no words. He remained leaning against the doorframe, letting mother and son share that moment undisturbed. For the first time in years, Hector felt that all his efforts, his struggle against the system, his decision to risk everything, had been worth it. That afternoon, Carol and Hector met in a quiet corner of the hospital, next to a small coffee machine that sputtered mechanically as it poured dark liquid into 2 disposable cups. They were both exhausted, but a calmness in the air allowed them, if only briefly, to relax. Carol took a sip of the hot coffee, letting the aroma fill her senses. Then she looked at Hector, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Hector. You didn't just save my son, you gave me back my hope." Hector lowered his gaze, somewhat uncomfortable with the praise, but when he lifted it again, he saw something more than gratitude in Carol's eyes. It was a connection that went beyond words, born of trust and a shared struggle. "It wasn't just me," he finally responded. "It was the whole team. And you, Carol, you never gave up. Your faith in Johnny pushed us to do the impossible." For the first time in a long while, a genuine smile crossed Hector's face. It wasn't a smile of pride in a job well done, but one that came from a deeper place, from the certainty that he had done something truly meaningful. Carol smiled back. "You are an exceptional man, Hector. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Meanwhile, in the pediatric ward, Lily had received the news that Johnny was better. Her excitement was so contagious that even the nurses around her smiled at her insistence. "I have to see him. I can't wait," she exclaimed, fidgeting in her bed. Finally, a nurse gave in and took her in a wheelchair to the recovery room. When Lily entered and saw Johnny sitting up in his bed, his face still pale but smiling, she let out a joyful cry. "I knew you could do it." Johnny looked up, his smile growing wider at the sight of her. "Lily, I'm better, and I already know where we'll put the climbing rope on our treehouse." Thrilled, Lily pulled a wrinkled drawing from her backpack and showed it to him. "I've been thinking too. I added another window here, so we can see the sunrise from the highest branches." The two children began talking excitedly, exchanging ideas and details about their imaginary project as if nothing had happened. In their small bubble of friendship, the world was a place full of possibilities, free from hospitals, tubes, and illness. From the doorway, Rose watched, smiling through a tear that rolled down her cheek. "Look what we've achieved," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. In that room, pain and suffering gave way to something far more powerful: hope. For Johnny and Lily, the future was no longer a place of fear, but a space to build dreams, one where the stars and the branches of their imagined tree awaited them. In the hospital's dimly lit laboratory, only the bright glow of a lamp illuminated Michael's workspace. Surrounded by stacks of papers, tissue samples, and his laptop, he worked with obsessive focus. He had spent weeks analyzing data and patterns, searching for answers, and now the pieces were finally falling into place. Michael studied the results of samples taken from patients in Johnny's neighborhood who were suffering from severe illnesses. The evidence was undeniable. The cadmium particles in the patient's tissues matched the industrial contaminants that Industrias Cobalto had dumped in the area for years. But it wasn't just a case of contamination. As he dug through the hospital's archives, Michael discovered something even more serious. Among the dusty documents and digital records, he found falsified environmental inspection reports. These documents, which should have exposed the dangers of chemical waste, had been tampered with to absolve the company. Worse still, some of these inspections had been authorized by Montiel, the hospital administrator. There were letters signed by him approving irregular operations, ensuring that complaints about the link between contamination and rising illnesses in the community were never investigated. The weight of his discovery fell heavily upon Michael. This wasn't just negligence, it was a large-scale corruption scheme. As he reviewed the evidence, he realized the truth was too big to ignore. He knew that revealing it could expose both Industrias Cobalto and Montiel himself, but he also understood that doing so involved significant risks. That same night, Michael shared his findings with Claudio Rojas. The journalist, known for his courage and skill in uncovering corruption, listened intently as Michael explained the magnitude of the problem. Stacks of papers, diagrams, and incriminating documents lay spread out on the table before them. "This is bigger than I thought," Claudio murmured, taking notes. "It's not just the company. Montiel, the hospital, they're deeply involved." Michael nodded. "We can't let this go unpunished. The lives of these people, these children, they're not just numbers in a report. Industrias Cobalto and everyone who covered for them must be held accountable." Claudio closed his notebook and looked at Michael solemnly. "I'm going to write about this, and it won't just be an article, it'll be a bombshell. When this story comes out, no one will be able to ignore it." Over the next few hours, Claudio began drafting a powerful, evidence-based piece. He included testimonies from patients and families, charts showing the rise in severe illnesses in the community, and a clear line connecting Industrias Cobalto's contamination to the decisions made by Montiel and local authorities. It was a compelling narrative, a denunciation that could change everything. Meanwhile, upon learning the extent of the problem, Carol felt a mixture of outrage and determination. She couldn't stand by while other children and families continued to suffer. She decided to take action and called a meeting with the parents from the neighborhood. The community hall was small and austere, with worn chairs and an old chalkboard on the wall. Yet it was filled with anxious voices and expectant gazes. Carol, holding the documents in her hand, stood before the group and began to speak. "We're all here because we've seen our families suffer," she said, her voice firm but charged with emotion. "I've lost count of how many children have fallen ill, how many lives have been destroyed. But we can't stay silent anymore. Industrias Cobalto is responsible, and we have the proof." Carol showed them the evidence provided by Michael and Claudio. She explained how the company had contaminated the area for decades, how the hospital and the authorities had covered it up. Some parents listened in fear, worried about confronting such a powerful company, while others felt their indignation swell inside them. "I understand that you're afraid," Carol continued, looking directly into their eyes. "I am too. But aren't you more afraid that this will continue? That other children will go through what ours have? This is our moment. We must act together." The words of Carol resonated throughout the room. Some parents began to nod, while others murmured among themselves. Slowly, a spark of both hope and outrage ignited in the group. With her determination and clarity, Carol emerged as a natural leader, someone capable of uniting the families in a common struggle. "We will file a class action lawsuit," she announced, her energy infecting everyone present. "We will make ourselves heard, and we will not stop until Industrias Cobalto and every responsible party face the consequences." That night, the neighborhood began to organize. What had once been fear and resignation transformed into a collective force, a movement driven by truth and justice. The battle for truth had begun, and with Carol at the forefront and Claudio working on the media front, the system that had protected Industrias Cobalto began to falter. The hospital was more agitated than usual. The hallways were filled with the hurried murmur of conversations and the constant beeping of heart monitors. Amid this chaos, a tragic piece of news shook those who knew Lily. She had grown gravely ill. It began with a sudden fever that rose rapidly, accompanied by chills and difficulty breathing. Her usual energy vanished almost immediately, leaving her bedridden. Rose, noticing the rapid decline, immediately called Hector, who arrived in Lily's room with a grave expression. The opportunistic infection now threatening her life was a common complication in immunocompromised patients like her, but its severity was unusual. Hector and Rose began working with an almost frantic urgency, checking her condition and trying to stabilize her. Hector adjusted the ventilator's settings while Rose prepared a new IV supply. However, the hospital's resources were limited, and the specific medicines Lily needed were not available in the storeroom. "We need those medications now, or she won't pull through," Hector said, his tone both professional and personal. Rose nodded firmly, but both knew that hospital logistics were not on their side. Meanwhile, upon learning of Lily's condition, Carol did not hesitate to join Hector in the search for the necessary resources. With her phone in hand, she began calling every possible contact: friends, neighbors, even charitable organizations. Carol moved heaven and earth to find the medicines and equipment that would save the girl. In a moment of frustration, she stopped in front of Hector. "We cannot depend on this hospital," she said, tears in her eyes. "Lily cannot wait." Hector nodded, his expression hardening. Together, they searched beyond the hospital's walls. They contacted nearby clinics, pharmacies, and even independent suppliers. Slowly, thanks to the donations of people who responded to Carol's pleas, they began to gather what they needed. In the pediatric ward, Johnny sat beside Lily's bed. His face showed a mix of worry and resolve. Although he was still recovering from his own surgery, he refused to leave his friend's side. In his hands, he held one of Lily's drawings, the blueprint of their dreamed-of treehouse. Carefully, Johnny stood and taped the drawing to the wall facing Lily's bed, ensuring it was placed where she could see it. Then he sat back down and gently took her hand. "Lily, you have to get better," he said quietly. "Remember our promise. We have a house to build, remember, with a rope to climb, a hammock to watch the clouds, and a window to look at the stars." Though Lily was weak, her eyes slowly opened at Johnny's voice. Her gaze settled on the drawing, and a small smile appeared on her face. Although she lacked the strength to speak, the spark in her eyes said more than 1,000 words. Johnny's constant presence was an anchor for Lily, a reminder that she had something worth fighting for. The promise of that treehouse, a dream they shared, became her motivation to keep going. With the medications finally in their hands, Hector and Rose returned to the pediatric ward. Hector administered the doses precisely while Rose monitored Lily's vital signs. The treatment began to take effect slowly, stabilizing her breathing and reducing the fever. Still, everyone knew the road to recovery would be long. That night, as Lily slept, Rose watched Johnny, who remained seated by her bed. Their hands were still entwined, a symbol of the friendship that bound them. Rose approached Hector and whispered, "That girl is not alone. Johnny is her strength." Hector nodded, looking at the scene with a mix of admiration and hope. "And she is his," he replied. In the following days, Lily began to show small signs of improvement. Each time she opened her eyes, she saw the drawing on the wall and Johnny by her side, telling her about the new details he had added to the treehouse. "Now we'll have a secret hatch," he said one afternoon, prompting Lily to let out a soft, barely audible laugh, but one full of life. The friendship between the two children, forged amid adversity, became an unbreakable force. In that small corner of the hospital, surrounded by monitors and medications, something far greater than a treehouse was being built, a bond that not only gave them hope, but also the strength to carry on. The courtroom was packed, filled with an expectant murmur that seemed to electrify the atmosphere. Affected families, journalists, and onlookers had gathered to witness the start of what promised to be a historic case, the class action lawsuit against Industrias Cobalto. Carol, leading the community, sat in the front row beside Hector. Her face reflected a mixture of determination and nerves, but her eyes were filled with fire. This was the moment she had fought for. Industrias Cobalto's legal representatives entered the room with confidence, impeccably dressed and surrounded by an air of superiority. Their strategy was clear: discredit the evidence and divert responsibility. From the start, they attempted to dismiss the case, arguing that there was not enough proof to establish a direct connection between the company's chemical spills and the diseases plaguing the community. "Environmental impact is a complex phenomenon," one of the lawyers stated, his tone secure and condescending. "Many factors could have contributed to the neighborhood's current conditions. Blaming my client exclusively is, at best, a simplistic interpretation." Carol clenched her fists, feeling anger bubbling inside her. But before she could speak, her attorney, a steadfast ally, stood up calmly. "Your Honor, we will present irrefutable scientific evidence showing that Industrias Cobalto is not only responsible for the toxic spills, but has also actively concealed their impact on the community's health for decades." As the trial progressed, Claudio Rojas published an explosive article in a national newspaper. The headline was blunt: "Industrias Cobalto, Decades of Corruption and Contamination." In the article, Claudio not only detailed the devastating impact of the chemical spills, but also included testimonies from affected families, charts based on Michael's analyses, and historical documents exposing how the company had manipulated environmental inspections with the help of corrupt officials, including Montiel. The article went viral within hours. Social media erupted with outraged comments, and several environmental organizations began protesting outside Industrias Cobalto's offices. Under public pressure, the authorities, who initially had shown little intention of acting, had no choice but to take the case seriously. In the courtroom, the trial intensified, turning into a legal battleground. Carol took the stand to testify, her voice trembling slightly at first, but gaining strength as she spoke. She described in detail how Johnny's illness had changed her life, how she had watched her son lose strength day after day while the system ignored her pleas. "It's not just my son," she said, looking directly at Industrias Cobalto's representatives. "There are dozens of children, hundreds of families. We have lost our loved ones because you decided it was cheaper to pollute than to prevent." Her testimony was followed by other parents, each sharing stories of loss and suffering. One mother spoke of how she had buried her 6-year-old daughter after a long battle with cancer. A father described how his wife had died of respiratory illness after years of living near contaminated grounds. Each voice added to the chorus of indignation, painting a heartbreaking picture impossible to ignore. Hector also took the stand, speaking with a mix of emotion and professionalism. He explained how he had come to understand the link between contamination and disease, describing in detail the devastating effects of cadmium on human tissues. But he also spoke from the heart, describing the impact this case had had on him as a doctor and as a human being. "We are not here just for a trial," said Hector, looking at the courtroom. "We are here because we need to send a clear message. Our children's lives are not negotiable." Meanwhile, Industrias Cobalto's lawyers tried to maintain their defense. They presented experts who offered complicated and technical arguments designed to sow doubt about the connection between the spills and the illnesses. However, the evidence submitted by Michael, along with the documentary proof obtained by Claudio, dismantled their claims one by one. The most impactful moment came when the court presented a series of internal Industrias Cobalto emails obtained through a leak. In them, high-level executives discussed how to minimize the media impact of the complaints and diverted attention toward other potential contamination sources. One particular line echoed in the room: "It's cheaper to pay fines than to clean up the land." The murmuring in the room grew until it became a hum of collective indignation. For the first time, Industrias Cobalto's lawyers seemed to falter. Carol and Hector worked side by side throughout the entire trial, not only as allies, but as an emerging couple who found strength in one another. Every night, after long courtroom sessions, they met to review the next day's strategy, sharing coffee and words of encouragement. A deep bond had formed between them, born of a shared struggle and the desire to protect what they loved most. The trial continued for weeks, attracting increasing media attention. In the end, the accumulated evidence and the passionate testimonies were too compelling to ignore. When it came time for closing arguments, the community's attorney addressed the jury with a statement that resonated with everyone present. "This case is not just about one company. It's about human dignity, about our responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. I ask you to deliver justice, not only for these families, but for all those who have ever been silenced by power." The trial was reaching its climax, and as Carol and Hector looked around the room full of hopeful faces, they knew that, regardless of the outcome, they had achieved something monumental. They had made the world listen. The atmosphere in the courtroom was solemn, charged with anticipation. The murmurs faded when the judge called the next witness. Hector Beltran, wearing a calm but determined expression, rose from his seat. As he walked toward the stand, each step echoed with the weight of what he was about to say. Hector had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but he knew that rehearsed words didn't matter. What he was about to share came straight from his heart, from the experiences that had transformed him and brought him here. Hector sat down, adjusted the microphone before him, and looked around the room. The courtroom was full: journalists, families, lawyers, and in the front rows, Carol. Her gaze, filled with silent support, gave him the push he needed to begin. "My name is Hector Beltran. I am a surgeon with more than 20 years of experience. But I'm not here solely as a doctor. I'm here as a witness to a community's suffering, to the harm that one company, Industrias Cobalto, has inflicted on the most vulnerable." The room fell completely silent, expectant. Hector continued, "I have worked with children who suffer from devastating diseases, many directly related to exposure to toxic contaminants. Children like Johnny, who came into my care with an advanced tumor that threatened his life. Or Lily, a brilliant, lively girl who has fought recurring infections due to an immune system weakened by years of exposure to these toxins." Hector paused, his voice charged with emotion. He looked at the jury, then at Industrias Cobalto's lawyers, who avoided his gaze. These children are not statistics. They are human beings. They are sons, daughters, brothers, friends, and they have suffered not only from illness, but from the abandonment of a system that should have protected them. Hector began detailing how contamination had worsened his patients' medical conditions. He explained, in clear but forceful terms, how cadmium and other heavy metals found in tissue samples directly affected human health. His scientific testimony was irrefutable, backed by Michael's analyses and the data Claudio had compiled. But what impacted the room most was his honesty in speaking about his own struggles as a doctor. Hector described the difficulties he faced trying to provide care in a system full of limitations and corruption. There was a time when I lost faith in myself as a physician. A past mistake led me to doubt my ability to save lives. But in the midst of this fight, working with Johnny, Lily, and other children, I rediscovered my purpose. They reminded me why I chose this profession: to protect, to fight, to give a chance to those who have no voice. Hector's voice cracked for a moment, but he continued, looking directly at the jury. Industrias Cobalto and those who have protected them have not only stolen these children's health, they have stolen their hope. But today, we are here to take it back, to ensure that their stories are heard and that their lives receive the value they have always deserved. When Hector finished, the silence in the room was absolute. Not a single face was free of emotion. Even the most skeptical members of the jury seemed moved by his testimony. Hector stepped down from the stand, shoulders upright, and a sense of liberation he hadn't felt in years. As he returned to his seat, Carol looked at him with tears in her eyes, conveying silent gratitude. While the trial continued, a small but significant victory was occurring in the hospital's pediatric ward. After days battling her infection, Lily began showing signs of improvement. Rose and Carol, who had stayed constantly by her side, exchanged looks of relief and happiness when the monitors indicated that her temperature had finally stabilized. "We did it," Rose whispered, gently touching Lily's forehead. Carol smiled, exhausted but filled with hope. When Lily opened her eyes and saw them, a faint smile crossed her face. Although still weak, her spirit remained intact. "Johnny?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Carol stroked her hair. "He's okay, Lily. He's waiting to see you. He wants to tell you about the new ideas he has for the treehouse." Lily's eyes lit up with a spark of excitement. "Then, I must be ready to see him." When Johnny finally visited Lily, the room filled with a special energy. Though both were still physically fragile, the bond between them was stronger than ever. Johnny, with his characteristic enthusiasm, began describing the details he had added to their shared dream. "Now we'll have a double rope ladder, in case someone wants to climb faster. And an extra hammock, so we can fall asleep watching the stars together." Lily, still weak but smiling, replied, "And a secret hatch to store our treasures. Remember?" "I always remember," Johnny answered, taking her hand. "It's our house, and we'll build it together." In the courtroom, Hector watched how his testimony had influenced the jury and everyone present. In the hospital, Lily and Johnny, bound by an unbreakable friendship, reminded each other that there were reasons to keep going. That day, Hector not only found redemption as a doctor, but also as a human being. In his fight for justice, he had recovered something he thought lost: faith in life and in the ability to make a real difference. The weeks of waiting for the verdict had been a whirlwind of emotions for everyone involved. The courtroom, packed with expectant families, journalists, and community members, was thick with tension when the decisive day finally arrived. The murmurs stopped abruptly as the judge entered, followed by the members of the jury. Every face in the room reflected a mix of anxiety and hope. Carol, seated beside Hector in the front row, clasped her hands tightly, silently praying for a verdict that would acknowledge her community's suffering and losses. Hector, though outwardly calm, felt the same knot in his stomach. This case was not only a crucial step toward justice for the families, but also a personal turning point that could close the wounds of his past. The judge called for silence, and with a firm yet serene voice, began to read the verdict. After carefully deliberating over the evidence presented, this jury finds Industrias Cobalto guilty of deliberate environmental negligence, fully aware of the devastating consequences to the health and well-being of the affected community. A murmur of approval swept through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The sentencing continued. In addition to acknowledging responsibility for its actions, Industrias Cobalto is required to pay significant compensation to the affected families and fund a comprehensive plan to clean up and restore the contaminated area. This court also mandates strict environmental oversight to ensure no further violations occur. Jubilation in the room was immediate. Some parents openly wept, embracing each other while journalists took notes frantically. Carol let out a deep sigh, on the verge of tears, as Hector placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, sharing in a silent, heartfelt celebration. This triumph was more than a legal victory. It was a vindication of the dignity and right to justice for a community that had been ignored and silenced for far too long. The neighborhood streets filled with joy and hope as families spread the news, turning what had been a place of struggle into a symbol of resilience. Carol, who had emerged as a leader during the trial, was celebrated as the driving force behind the case. Her voice, her determination, and her ability to unite the families had been key to the lawsuit's success. But for Carol, the real triumph was seeing the families of her community begin to imagine a different future, one where their children could live without fear of disease. For Hector, the victory carried a deeply personal meaning. The positive impact of his testimony not only strengthened the case against Industrias Cobalto, but also changed the public's perception of his career. Shortly after the verdict, he received the news that his medical license would be reinstated, an official acknowledgement of his dedication and courage in the face of adversity. However, Hector knew his true purpose did not lie in returning to prestigious hospitals. He decided to remain in the neighborhood and use his expertise to make a lasting difference. With the support of the families and a portion of the awarded compensation, Hector announced the opening of a community clinic. This gesture not only symbolized his commitment to those who needed him most, but also his desire to redeem his past by helping build a brighter future. "This place won't just be a clinic," Hector said at the opening, surrounded by neighbors. "It will be a space where everyone can access dignified medical care, no matter their circumstances. This is where I start anew." Meanwhile, the relationship between Hector and Carol blossomed. What had begun as an alliance for a common cause had transformed into a profound, genuine connection. They shared not only a past filled with struggles, but also a vision of the future founded on hope and joint effort. One afternoon, as they walked through the neighborhood, Carol pointed to an empty lot filled with tall, sturdy trees. "You know, this place would be perfect to build something special." Hector looked at her curiously. "What do you have in mind?" Carol smiled, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "A treehouse. For Johnny, Lily, and all the children who have fought so hard. A place where they can dream and feel that nothing is impossible." Hector chuckled softly. "I think that's the best idea I've heard in a long time." The neighborhood, once a symbol of neglect, began to change. The first machines arrived to clean the contaminated lands, and the families, inspired by the struggle led by Carol and Hector, started rebuilding not only their homes, but also their lives. Carol, now a recognized figure in the community, worked tirelessly to ensure every family had access to the opportunities they deserved. From health programs to educational initiatives, her leadership extended beyond the trial. For Hector, the community clinic became a second home. Every patient he treated, every child he helped, reminded him why he had chosen this profession. In each face, he saw not just gratitude, but the hope of a better future. The verdict against Industrias Cobalto marked the beginning of a profound change. Although the fight was not completely over, the community had recovered something invaluable, its voice. And with that voice, they began to write a new story, one of justice, resilience, and a future full of possibilities. The golden afternoon sun lit up a nearby hillside, where a small but united group worked with energy and joy. At the center of the scene stood a sturdy, ancient tree, rising majestically, its branches stretching toward the sky as if embracing the dreams of those around it. It was the perfect place for the long-awaited treehouse. Johnny and Lily, now in remission and brimming with renewed vitality, led the project with contagious enthusiasm. Although both remained physically more fragile than other children their age, they refused to let that stop them. With small tools in their hands and unwavering determination on their faces, they helped Hector secure the first planks to the tree trunk. "That board goes here," exclaimed Johnny, pointing to a specific spot in the design he and Lily had imagined so many times. His excitement made everyone around him smile. Lily, paintbrush in hand, covered a piece of wood in a vibrant sky blue. "And this will be our window to watch the stars. It has to be perfect." Hector, kneeling beside the trunk, helped fasten the planks with nails. His movements were precise, his face reflecting a mix of concentration and satisfaction. "Are you sure this rope ladder will hold all your friends?" he asked teasingly. "Of course," Lily replied, with a laugh that rang out like a chime in the calm air. "It's a magical ladder. It will hold everything." Carol, standing next to Hector, held a bucket of nails and hammers, watching as the children debated the design details. Her gaze was filled with love and pride, not just for her son, but for the strength both children had shown during their struggle. While the children worked on the details of their dreamed home, Carol and Hector took a moment to sit on a blanket spread out under the tree. From there, they watched as Johnny and Lily argued about which colors to use for the interior walls. The scene was so simple, and yet so full of meaning. "Do you realize how far we've come?" Carol asked, her voice soft but laden with emotion. Hector, looking at the children with a gentle smile, nodded. "Every day surprises me more, not only because of what they've accomplished, but what they've taught us. They made me remember that there's always something worth fighting for." Carol looked at him, and in her eyes there was more than gratitude. There was hope. There was affection. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Hector. All of this. You were an essential part of our success." Hector looked away for a moment, uncomfortable with the recognition, then turned his attention back to Carol. "I couldn't have done it without you. You led an entire community. I only helped a bit." They both laughed softly, sharing a moment of complicity that went beyond words. There, beneath the tree that was now the heart of a shared dream, they found something else, a second chance, not only to rebuild their lives, but to create something new together. Hours later, as the sun began to set, the basic structure of the treehouse was finished. The children climbed up the rope ladder carefully, helped by Hector and Carol. From above, the view was impressive. They could see the neighborhood, now in the midst of transformation. Machines were cleaning the contaminated lands, while families worked together to rebuild their homes and their community. Johnny and Lily, seated on the wooden floor of their new home, looked toward the horizon, where the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Lily, resting her head on Johnny's shoulder, whispered, "We did it." "Yes," Johnny answered, smiling. "And there's still more to come." From below, Carol and Hector watched them, their silhouettes outlined against the bright sky. The treehouse was more than just a structure. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome and what they could achieve together. Johnny and Lily sat together in the treehouse as the neighborhood lights began to flicker on one by one. The transformation was evident. The families, united, worked side by side, and the neighborhood that had once been marked by despair now shone with resilience and hope. The final message was clear. Unity, love, and determination could overcome even the greatest challenges. In that small corner of the world, a group of people had proven that, together, they could build something extraordinary. And so, with a feeling of fulfillment and promises kept, the story came to an end. The story of Johnny, Lily, Hector, and Carol leaves us with a profound reflection on resilience, the importance of community, and the transformative power of hope. In a world where adversities seem insurmountable, this narrative reminds us that even in the darkest moments, the union of people can generate light and open paths toward a better future. Each character represents a facet of human struggle. Johnny and Lily, with their innocence and dreams, teach us that even in fragility there can be strength. Carol, with her unwavering determination, shows how love can become a force capable of moving mountains. Hector, on his path to redemption, proves that it is never too late to find purpose and that mistakes do not define us if we choose to fight for what's right. The community, by raising its voice against injustice, reminds us that when people unite for a common cause, they have the power to topple oppressive systems and build something better. This story also highlights the value of shared dreams. The treehouse, beyond being a children's project, symbolizes the place we all aspire to reach, a space where we are free to be who we want to be, far from the world's burdens. Building that treehouse reflects the collective effort to heal wounds, not only physical but emotional ones as well. It represents the connection between generations, the transmission of hope, and the commitment of those who, like Hector and Carol, decided to transform their pain into actions that benefit others. In a context where corruption and negligence seemed invincible, the story teaches us that truth and justice always have a place, even if the road to reach them is arduous. The greatest battles are not won by a single heroic act, but through small daily decisions that, accumulated over time, create a lasting impact. From Hector's decision to operate on Johnny at great risk, to Carol's courage in leading a community, and the unbreakable friendship between Johnny and Lily, each individual action contributed to a collective triumph. It's also important to reflect on how challenges can bring people together. Adversity, though painful, can serve as a catalyst for individuals who seem to have nothing in common to work together toward a shared goal. Hector and Carol, from different worlds, found in their joint struggle not just a cause, but also a bond that allowed them to heal and grow. The community, once fragmented by fear and despair, became a living testament to the power of solidarity. Finally, this story invites us to believe in second chances. Each character undergoes a transformation, reminding us that there is always room for change. Hector regains his purpose and redeems his mistakes by dedicating his life to helping those who need it most. Carol, who at first seemed consumed by despair, emerges as a leader capable of inspiring others. Johnny and Lily, who faced their own mortality, show us that even in the hardest fight, dreams can remain alive and become a source of strength. In the end, the treehouse is not just a physical construction. It is a symbol of what can be achieved when people do not lose faith in themselves or in each other. This story leaves us with a hopeful message. Even though the road may be filled with obstacles, there is always a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to create something new. The key is not giving up, seeking support in those around us, and remembering that in the end, the most important battles are not fought for ourselves alone, but for the legacy we leave and for those who come after us. It's a reminder that, even if the world seems broken, there is always room to build a refuge, a treehouse from which we can gaze at the stars and dream of a future full of possibilities. Thank you for joining us in this thrilling and hopeful story. Remember that, just like Johnny and Lily, we can all build our own treehouse, a place where dreams and unity overcome any adversity. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content that reminds us of the power of hope. Until next time.